Right, welcome to lesson 17.2. We are focusing on climate change still. This lesson is going to focus on sources and then the current state of climate change. So learning objective is that you will be able to identify key greenhouse gases and then describe the current state of climate change. So success criteria, you have one, and that is to be able to list the primary greenhouse gases and their sources. So there are 4 primary greenhouse gases. You should also be able to tell me where they come from. So the most important greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, chlorofluorocarbons, and then nitrous oxide. So carbon dioxide, or CO2, is the most abundant of the greenhouse gases and is responsible for about 65% of global warming, so just over half. And it occurs as a natural consequence of respiration and fermentation by organisms. In the natural cycle of things, this is where carbon dioxide is released. Every time you breathe out, you are releasing carbon dioxide. Large quantities are put into the atmosphere as a waste product of burning fossil fuels. This is where the issue comes in. This carbon dioxide that's circulated through respiration and fermentation, that's at levels that we expect naturally, but with burning fossil fuels, we're putting extra back out. Another factor that contributes to the increase in concentration of carbon dioxide is deforestation. That's because trees are long-lived organisms that store a lot of carbon. So when you cut down a bunch of trees, you're taking out a ton of organisms that usually are taking in a ton of carbon dioxide and storing it for a long amount of time. Measurements of carbon dioxide levels at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii shows that carbon dioxide levels increased by about 317 parts per million in 1960 to over 411 in 2019. This is an increase of almost 30%. And it's generally accepted that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere before the Industrial Revolution was about 280. So even in 1960, we were pretty high above that. The current concentration represents an increase of 47% over pre-industrial concentration. So we've almost 50% of an increase. And these are those measurements from that observatory. So in 1960, we were just below 320, and then up to 2020, we are at about 410, 411. So the next greenhouse gas that we're going to talk about is methane. Methane is CH4, and it's the second most abundant. It's responsible for about 17% of global warming, and it comes from biological sources as a byproduct of fossil fuel use. So it's another thing released by burning fossil fuels. Several kinds of microorganisms that are particularly abundant in wetlands and rice paddies also release methane into the atmosphere. And then also, many animals have microorganisms in their digestive system that break down food and release methane, like cows. Natural gas is primarily methane, and oil and coal contain some methane as well. Currently, the amount of methane in the atmosphere is increasing. Pre-industrial concentrations were about 700 parts per billion. Currently, we are about 1900. So these are those levels from 1750 up to 2020. And that might not look like a huge increase, but we're going from 700 up to almost 2000. Nitrous oxide is the third. It's a minor component of the greenhouse gas picture, and it enters the atmosphere primarily through the use of fertilizers and fossil fuels. And nitrogen-containing fertilizers and animal manure used to improve agricultural production contain nitrogen compounds because plants need nitrogen to grow. And certain soil bacteria can convert these compounds to nitrous oxide. Air contains both oxygen and nitrogen. Nitrogen is 70% of air around us. During the process of burning fossil fuels, the oxygen and nitrogen combine to produce a variety of nitrogen-containing compounds, and one of those is nitrous oxide. And this is the change in that concentration over time. Chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, are a synthetic compound. They're a minor component of the greenhouse gas picture. There are no natural sources of CFCs, so we know that anything that's found in the atmosphere is released by humans. CFCs were widely used as a refrigerant gas in refrigerators and air conditioners, as cleaning solvents, as propellant in aerosol containers, and expanders in foam products. They are extremely efficient. So they are, even though they are a tiny percentage of the atmosphere, they're 15,000 times more efficient at slowing heat loss than carbon dioxide is. And because chlorofluorocarbons are a major cause of ozone destruction, production and the use of CFCs has been reduced and scheduled to be eliminated by 2020. So new products should not contain CFCs at all. And because of this decrease, we have seen atmospheric levels decrease as well. All right, so you can pause and look. Principal sources of each, the percentage it's contributing to global warming, and then what their concentration is. So, in 1988, the United Nations Environment Program and the World Meteorological Organization established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We got a lot of big words here. IPCC, to study the issue and make recommendations. So this is where we get a lot of our current state of knowledge about climate change. The main activity of the IPCC is to provide an assessment of the state of knowledge about climate change at regular intervals. The IPCC has organized into several different working groups. Working Group 1 deals with the physical science that relates to climate change. Working Group 2 deals with the impacts of climate change. And then Working Group 3 deals with how to mitigate. So first is physical science, 2 is the impacts, and then 3 is how do we solve that? How do we mitigate that? Working Group 1 published its portion of the fifth assessment in 2013. 259 scientists, so it's not just a few, that's a lot, from around the world were involved in writing portions of the report, and over 600 people contributed material. Their report restated several important conclusions from previous reports. 1, that human activity is clearly influencing climate, there's no question. 2, that increased concentrations of the greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, are causing an increase in temperature. 3, that evidence of increased temperature is clear, which is the evidence behind that is that the average temperature of the Earth has increased by 0.65 to over a whole degree Celsius since 1880, which may seem tiny, but that's a big deal. Amounts of spring snow and ice have decreased in the northern hemisphere, and snow is melting earlier in the year. The number of cold days has decreased, and the number of warm days has increased. The Arctic region is warming 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the world. And permafrost, which is permanently frozen soil temperatures, have increased, and the thickness of that permafrost layer has decreased. There's also been a reduction in the area covered by Arctic sea ice. Greenland and Arctic ice sheets have been losing mass, so they're getting smaller, they're melting. Glaciers are melting. And the arrival of spring is earlier in many parts of the world. And then their fourth finding was that increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and increased temperature are affecting oceans. About 28% of carbon dioxide emissions end up in the ocean, and this increase in CO2 dissolving in the water has, decreased the pH. And this is a 26% increase in the hydrogen ion concentration, which does affect how creatures in the sea can form shells and things like that. About 90% of the additional energy added to the Earth has been stored in the oceans, resulting in an increase of about 0.44 degrees Celsius in the temperature of the upper 75 meters of the oceans in the last 40 years. When we're talking about additional energy, we're talking about heat. That is how energy is stored as it hits the Earth. Sea level rise, sea level has risen about 19 centimeters, and the rate of sea level rise has also increased. All right, let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next one.